Deming had a quote that really stuck with me, and it was, every system is designed perfectly to get the results that it gets. And we're seeing that right now. And I think when you say resilience, there's a fundamental flaw in that word and that approach, because we don't step back and say, are we designing the right outcome? Are we really focused on fixing the system and the system level, thinking and processes and all the things that you mentioned in this question before we start acting? And so best practice to answer the question would be to fundamentally step back and say, are we looking at building circularity in our supply chains? Are we looking at regeneration? Are we looking at creating the type of economy and the type of partnerships and networks that we can really be proud of, that give back more than they take?
Thank you so much for joining another edition of The Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. Today, I have the great pleasure of being joined by Sheri Hinish, the supply chain queen. Sheri, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate the invite. And hello, everyone who is watching, listening, and streaming on demand.
That's awesome. Sheri, you show up and have been one of the originals who have been showing up, sharing thought leadership, advice, wisdom around supply chain for longer than most others. I know I've been at this for 2.5 years, coming up on 3, and you've been doing this for 11 years. So thank you for, in part, in your own way, inspiring what we're doing, and for continuing to show up with this consistency. There's something beautiful about consistency in supply chain, especially as we aim at those topics around sustainability, around innovation, and those movements forward. What's on your heart today that you know would help serve a group of supply chain and procurement professionals?
Well, I think what's on my heart is that although we love consistency, we are in an evolving, never normal world. And I thought we saw the last of it during COVID. And so for a lot of folks that are listening and joining functionally from the area and space we share, right now is a never normal period, with a lot of things that are happening: geopolitical risk, climate and weather variation, all of the externalities and risks that we typically haven't had to manage in our traditional plan, source, make, deliver processes. We're dealing with these things real time right now, and it can feel a little bit chaotic. So what's on my heart is thank you so much for your impact, for everyone listening, for making sure that goods show up on people's front door, on the shelves, and that the world keeps moving.
Yeah, there's a sense of all of those people that make these things happen that are invisible until they don't work. And then people really notice.
Enter the toilet paper crisis of 2020 or 2021.
Right. So many examples of the people that are behind the scenes moving the world and helping make things happen. I think there's a sense too that when we're evaluating where to spend our time, and there's so much ongoing change and a degree of unpredictability that's certainly increased in the last little while, there's a sense of how do I keep up? There's a sense of where do I aim my time and attention? And then how do I think about this? And I know these from the perspective of sustainability. Sometimes the sustainability is the sustainability of the team members themselves, in addition to the supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, people show up with their values, and they show up with purpose and what matters to them in their day-to-day life. And hopefully that shows up in the work that they lead. Sustainability can mean a lot of things. Just like if you were to say 10 or 20 years ago, I work in supply chain, that could mean 15 different things, right? And sustainability is similar. Sustainability could mean resilience and risk resilience. It could mean decarbonization. It could mean circularity. It could mean a lot of really cool things that I think may not have the same charge in the US or other parts of the world that sustainability does. But almost everyone that I meet shows up with sustainability in their heart, on their supply chain team.
Yeah, there's something about the way that we get to bring our values into the work that we do, into the people that we choose to work with. I know there's a tremendous opportunity to look at some of the noise that may be there in the world and ground ourselves in the things that are going to matter to our 8-year-old self and our 80-year-old self.
Exactly. What will you be known for? What is
Yeah.
your legacy? I don't know that those were questions that we asked ourselves. Certainly something that I'm pondering right now as I approach the middle of my life. I'm not going to say how old I am, but I have a child that's going to graduate high school and go off to college. And certainly, you think about these things now, especially with what's happening in the world. How can I make an impact in the world that we share and create a future that my kids and my grandkids can be proud of and that I can be proud of right now from where I'm devoting my time and energy?
There's something in the way that you said that it shines for me. And what I talk about is the never ending climb of building a stronger you so that you can create the change in the world that you want to see. And there's the opportunity to call it be the change that you want to see. And then the example that we set for others in the way that we show up, either how we work, the results we create, the outcomes we leave behind, the footprints we leave through life. And I think supply chain keeps leaving its own footprints, whether that's in consumer products, whether that's in industrials. And this is really where I think the resilience comes back into it. I'm imagining you've seen some great examples of resilience in your work where there are ability to respond quickly to things that are changing. Sometimes it's the people that are responding and maybe pulling an all-nighter from time to time. We like not to. Or there's some technology or some process changes or even just the way that we think about things. People are often seeking examples of what good looks like. And I know you see some of the best.
Yeah, I love the framing. I have to push back a little bit on it though, because
Please.
resilience, I think, has been the answer to disruption in the past 10 years. We'll just say the past decade. And it's not that it's the wrong answer, but I think it's incomplete because when you think about how we've typically responded in terms of disruption, even what's happening right now, it's fundamentally based on protecting cost, speed, and scale. And so those answers have been nearshoring, for redundancy, right? A lot of the things that are baked into resilience, but bouncing back from a strategy in a system that created the problem in the first place is not really a strategy. I think it's more like a prayer. You keep doing the same thing over and over. And leaning on my manufacturing background, Deming had a quote that really stuck with me, and it was, every system is designed perfectly to get the results that it gets. And we're seeing that right now. And I think when you say resilience, there's a fundamental flaw in that word and that approach because we don't step back and say, are we designing the right outcome? Are we really focused on fixing the system and the system level, thinking and processes and all the things that you mentioned in this question before we start acting? And so best practice to answer the question would be to fundamentally step back and say, are we looking at building circularity in our supply chains? Are we looking at regeneration? Are we looking at creating the type of economy and the type of partnerships and networks that we can really be proud of that give back more than they take? Or are we just stuck in this linear extractive model of cost, speed, and scale that leaves us with fragility and exposure that we're living through right now?
To me, that really highlights wonderfully the expanded definition of resilience in stepping back regularly to make sure that we're looking at the forest for the trees. The idea that the questions that got us here will not be the same questions that get us through the challenge at hand as the challenge shifts so dramatically from those the system was designed for. And I think this, no knock on accountants, but I know from time to time they can get very fixated on that cost per. And the cost per
Yeah.
is something that I've found to be particularly challenging to get past in the way that we optimize.
The cost per, tell me about that, because that's a cool phrase. The cost per, what does that mean?
The cost per X. It could be cost per widget, cost of transportation per kilometer. It could be cost per shop floor hour. Could be cost per X, right? Whatever X is, and there is an over optimization as a basic pattern where overemphasis on trying to peanut butter costs in new and creative ways to create a better, more complete picture, to get the perfect answer to what is our cost per widget or our cost to serve, cost to transport, etc. When the variation between fixed and variable is on the other side of a whole lot of assumptions. And I think this is one of the opportunities where a more holistic look at the sustainability of the supply chain and the variability within it. I find myself more fascinated. I'm curious for your take. I find myself more fascinated with the variability in supply chain than a cost per unit.
Yeah, and I think even when you say like cost per unit, what does cost mean? I think that a lot of risk, frankly, has been externalized. And so we have things that maybe we didn't think about before that absolutely affect cost, like weather, like climate, like water, like soil.
Oh, yeah.
Like things that are connected to nature and biodiversity and things that would be considered in a sustainability category, so to speak, and things that show up in cost. You also have things like, the social aspects of sustainability, protecting human rights and forced labor and casual labor and collective bargaining. And like all of these things are also embedded in your total landed cost, but they're also risks that you have to manage. So when we talk about the world resilience and how it relates to cost, I would say that there are probably 4 things that you should focus on. It's not necessarily a roadmap, but if you think of them in terms of building blocks, it's how you intentionally build resilience and build a regenerative supply chain, but consequentially, you probably lower your cost too. So understanding risks, building visibility and traceability, which is the infrastructure, I think, of what people want when they want lower costs, but they also want to be future fit and innovative and all the things that are going to make them competitive in the future.
Yeah.
And then I think the capability that underpins that is really talent. So people, upskilling, and then technology sitting in concert with each other. And then lastly, what we opened with is the design. Like you need to fundamentally step back and redesign the operating logic. So if you do those things, I think you consequentially arrive at a lower total cost with more holistic considerations than maybe business as usual or linear supply chain today.
Yeah, 100%. I know a conversation I had yesterday was focused around whether or not a leadership team was going to support an investment in a particular area of their business without oversharing. One group was risk focused. The other group was, what's the cold, hard TCO, return on investment? One of the most fascinating parts of that conversation to me was it was actually the finance team and the accounting team that was risk focused. And it was another group that was questioning the business case. And the opportunity to step back and deeply consider cost of risk and how that factors in to the conversations and decisions that we're making, I think is an underdeveloped skill for a lot of organizations. And so what I really enjoy about what you were highlighting was the opportunity for leaders in procurement, in supply chain, to take that, what is likely an underdeveloped set of appreciation of risk, cost of risk, how we manage or mitigate or share that risk, and then the residual that we now need to really inspect. I find myself intrigued. What are you finding leaders in procurement, in supply chain doing to help bring that risk lens back to the equation? If they're maybe faced with, I'll call it a more cost-based, the more tangibly accessible costs that they are perhaps find it easier to throw into an Excel spreadsheet. Where I'm just imagining that you've seen some examples of what good looks like in
Yeah, I
helping to
have.
render that conversation.
So I think it would show up in three areas. It's going to show up first in the compliance or regulatory wave area. Second, it will show up in circularity, and I can talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, please.
And then the last category is probably innovation, thinking differently, and being the first mover on some exponential technologies. This could be a really long answer, so I'm not going to give you the full, the full answer, but just to give you a flavor. When we think about compliance, there's typically a carrot or a stick. And right now, coming out of the EU, there's a lot of mandatory disclosure that's accelerating. And it's also showing up in the state of California right now. It's potentially going to show up in New York and Washington later. And so what this means is if you don't comply, there's a cost associated. And that cost could be, in one client example, using just the 4 regulations. CBAM is one, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, DPP, Digital Product Passports, CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Say that 3 times really quickly. And then the last is EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility. So if we just take these 4 regulations, in one client example, using 3 of them, and EUDR, which is around deforestation and trying to dial in like environmental stewardship and the care of forests and biomass, it was $187 million cost takeout when they looked at their current brand, their current network, their sourcing strategy, and their distribution strategy. And so there's real cost implications if we just isolate the regulatory wave. And what does the regulatory wave mean for people in supply chain and procurement listening? It means carbon data is now a financial obligation at the EU border. It was live in 2026. In 2027, there are certificates required for embedded carbon and for the measurement and the verification of carbon. You're going to pay at the border soon. And there are specific categories and all the things. But the point here is that the market is not asking, the market is requiring this. And supply chain, this is your moment because you have a real savings opportunity. You know what I mean? And so the other thing that I want to mention, digital product passports is something that when we hear about transparency and traceability, I mean, this is a vision that's coming to life, but there are specific regulatory requirements. And when you think about being able to see, the story of something that you use every day, like take, for example, my smartphone or the cup of coffee that I drank this morning, everything has a story of its own making. And when you think about how these things move and flow across supply chains and all the different actors, the possibility for cost savings, redesign, and transformation are nearly limitless. And so for DPP or Digital Product Passport, having that origin, having very specific data and analytics and insights into material and financial flows and circular recovery data is really inspiring for people. That would take me into the second category, which is circularity. And so there's been tons of research. There's one research example from, I believe it was late November of last year. And this was something that was studied by Bain, WEF, and I believe the University of Cambridge. And one of the things that was interesting, it was sort of like what you said. It was, what's the business case, right? What's the business case for making these investments, looking at costs differently, but more importantly, considering things like circularity and sustainability and hardening. It's not expensive. It's actually the future of your business. And in this study, there were 491 manufacturing executives surveyed, and this represented 10 sectors globally. It was crazy, Sean, is that almost 80% of these executives said, absolutely, circularity is critical for our business. But only 20% of those executives said that their capabilities, current state, were fit for purpose. And so you look at that 60-point gap. It's not a knowledge gap. It's not a technology gap. It's a design gap. And so that ties in closely to the third category that I mentioned. I think the other thing was the revenue opportunity. So within 3 years, 95% of those same executives said circularity will be critical to their business surviving. In fact, 80% expected circular revenue to exceed current company averages. And I see this a lot in specific sectors. But what was crazy to me is the gap between the knowing, the ambition, and the ability to execute. So that's not a sustainability conversation. That's a business case. That's a revenue conversation. And when you think about circularity, it's not an alternative to growth. I think it's the next model for growth. And then that takes you naturally into design, product design, sourcing design, network design, looking at things very differently and opening the aperture where you say, this phone, we can't just design to get it to the manufacturing gate or the distribution gate or even in the customer's home. How are we going to bring that back into a reverse supply chain? Because it still has value after the software update.
Yeah. After the software update and after it starts feeling slower.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a long answer, but I think it would give people an idea of how to look at cost and innovation slightly differently in their role right now, looking at, compliance, which will build an adequate supply chain, but then looking at things like circularity, looking at design and innovation, which can help you build an extraordinary supply chain.
What I love about this is the emphasis on knowing and doing, and the knowing and the capability, and the doing the first few times feels awkward. I can reflect on the first few times I recorded this podcast, still wondering how on earth did I ever agree with myself to show up on LinkedIn as somebody who's fairly private. But I think this idea of going from consciously incompetent to moving through all of the stages to become consciously and then unconsciously competent at what you're doing. And that line of just getting to consciously competent is excruciating for many organizations to create the conditions for that change. And then to create that as that next level of, if we think about it through that frame of being unconsciously competent at supporting circularity, at supporting clarity of what the big picture is and whether the design of the system works, and creating the conditions that becomes automatic, it starts to feel a little bit like water flowing downhill, and it's just easier that way. But getting to that point where you've created the channels and the routes and paths for that water that's the mission for all of us as leaders in supply chain, is to create those conditions to ask the question. And then I love the emphasis that you place on design, because you can do it by default or you can do it by design.
Right.
And that by design is forcing those next level questions. I think that there's something tremendous in giving those leaders the opportunity, the permission and the encouragement to go and ask those questions of, does our requirement and what we would like to have designed meet our status quo and our current competence? And I think that survey really emphasizes that for the most part, the answer is no. So then as leaders, we get to ask, so now what are we doing about it?
Yeah, I can tell you. And again, this is over 2 decades of hard-earned experience where things haven't always gone right, in full transparency, right? And there's a structural mistake where I think, you just mentioned it. The business case is made, there's an ambition and a value realized gap. And typically there are two denominators or two parts to why we have the gap or the structural mistake. And it's talent. We haven't upskilled. We haven't prepared our workforce. We haven't set the right tone at the top, buzz at the bottom. And we're not empowering our people with agency to make better decisions. And it shows up and they're super proud of the transformation or whatever we're asking of them. The second is technology. And so I think when technology gets implemented by people not designed into its deployment, it will always underperform. And there's a lot riding on, I'm not going to use the phrase digital transformation because now, this whole like monolithic ERP upgrade, that's sort of a way of the past. I'm talking about like even using agentic or even using other forms of exponential tech like blockchain and industrial IoT and digital twins. Like you have to do a fundamental reset, and that includes your people.
Yeah.
Right? These things can't be separated.
You can give them a great tool, but if they're not ready for it, they're not ready for it.
Right. And talent develops capabilities, that have infrastructure that scale with it. And if you don't have that infrastructure, people get super frustrated. Your best, highest performers walk out the door. But think about, what would happen if we close our eyes and we have a technology strategy that's built around human capability development, and talent strategy is built around a technology roadmap. That's something entirely different. You stop implementing tools and you start building a new type of intelligence, institutional intelligence. And that's something that is required for the future of work and automation. When you think about a lot of companies that are rushing into AI and agentic, you need that because the context and why these decisions are made, I would call it tribal knowledge. It lives in your people. So technology is not the transformation. I would say it's the infrastructure that makes transformation possible. But the right intelligence, the right design logic, the right why, the things that we've talked about, like that transforms supply chains. Technology just amplifies what they're already doing.
And I think that amplification, when done through that lens of building the system and creating that consciously capable, then replacing that with a combination of the talent and the system starting to move together, that information flow, that knowledge flow, and the why is it built and designed this way, as opposed to the 17 other ways that might be helpful for one group within the supply chain. Speaking of cost taking, I think this combination is a much more effective picture of what good looks like. Sheri, I am really grateful for you sharing time with us today. And I am confident anybody watching this will have taken several nuggets away that will serve them on their never-ending climb for a stronger supply chain. Last thoughts just as we wrap up and land the plane here today, Sheri.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite and the invitation to share. I would love to connect with whoever's listening. You can reach out to me across social media or LinkedIn, Supply Chain Queen, Sheri Hinish, whatever search term you use. And I just would like to say, never underestimate the influence and impact that you can have in your role. Supply chains are incredibly important in terms of shaping the future that we all want and we know that we need. Over 40% of the world works in a supply chain.
Yeah.
and almost all of us participate in a supply chain. So you don't have to look far. You can open whatever social media news app you want. You can turn on the television. We need you. And literally, like, if you work in supply chain and you listen to 10% of what we just talked about, now is your moment. So don't underestimate the impact and influence that you can have.
That is beautiful. That call to action, Sheri. Go make it happen. And anybody that is wondering, I have it on firsthand knowledge that Sheri is tremendously helpful for organizations that she works with. So thank you again so much for joining. And for all of you watching, this has been another edition of The Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. We'll see you next week.